I want to welcome everybody to this episode of The American Idea. Very special episode today. We're joined by Ken Starr, who currently serves as of counsel for the Lanier Law Group and is a commentator for Fox News. And in fact, last evening on the Ingram angle to talk with his national audience. As many of our listeners and viewers know, Ken has been United States Circuit Court Judge, the U.S. Solicitor General, independent counsel, and a partner in major law firms. Also served as the Dean of Pepperdine Law School and President of Baylor University. Ken, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, so good to be with you, Jeff. Thank you for the invitation.
Let's start. Your interest in civic education. You have become part of, very graciously agreed to become part of Ashbrook's National Advisory Board on Civic Education. You're writing now in your most recent book on religious liberty, and you have some discussion in there of the importance of citizens understanding the principles, the constitutional, legal, and moral principles of religious liberty. What has turned your mind and heart toward civic education and educating Americans in these principles?
Because of the collapse of civic education in the United States, and as you have rightly said at the center, quoting Dr. Franklin, it's a republic if you can keep it. And so the principles of the American founding are so precious. They're under assault, but there's also an enormous amount of ignorance, just lack of understanding. So we need to return to recapture what I call the culture of freedom, which is what, of course, America stands for. And that basic principle is really under assault right now. In fact, I had a debate recently, or discussion with Dean Erwin Chemerinsky, a brilliant scholar from Cal Berkeley. And we just had a fundamental disagreement that he said for the last half century, and I'm paraphrasing here, and I want to do justice to what Dean Chemerinsky was trying to convey to the audience, that we have set our sights on equality as opposed to freedom. And there is hopefully congruence between the two, but at times there is tension, if not outright conflict, depending upon the issue and the policy response to the question of the day.
Right. You've seen it in your time in American public life. I take it an erosion of understanding of the Constitution, of constitutional principles. Your new book tries to address what you see as a crisis on a core fundamental issue for American public life, which is religious liberty. Tell us about the book, and particularly the genesis of the book and the argument of it.
The genesis was probably about 40 years in the making. When I moved into the Justice Department in the Reagan administration, and really became deeply involved in religious freedom issues, among others. But the catalyst was the pandemic, and when we saw governors and mayors taking remarkable action, closing down churches or severely limiting attendance at religious group meetings, worship services, and so forth. I said, I think we need a return to first principles, the principles of freedom, and of course, the religion clauses are the very first part of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
The book and the argument of the book. For our listeners who will not only want to get a copy and read it, give us a preview, the argument that you're making there.
That there needs to be an understanding of 6 great principles of religious liberty, such as freedom of conscience, and how freedom of conscience can in fact carry the day even when there are other very important values at stake, and so there's a clash of values. The idea of the autonomy, the independence of religious institutions, including the ability to hire and fire. Very important now, especially in the days when we're, of course, all sensitive to issues of discrimination and wiping out discrimination. But what happens when there's a conflict between civil rights laws and religious autonomy? And happily, part of my message in the book is the Supreme Court, time after time over the past 40 years, not always, but time after time, has been the friend of religious liberty, including of religious institutions and churches and church leaders, synagogues, mosques, they all need to be aware of these great principles that have been enduringly important in the American constitutional experience.
Right. And that's interesting when you think about it, because I think most people would think of religious liberty as an individual constitutional right. You're making the argument that it also applies to associations.
Exactly right. And the Supreme
like
Court
churches.
reaffirmed that in June of this very year of 2021 in upholding the religious liberty, and they did so unanimously, of Catholic social services to frankly discriminate in terms of the placement of foster children under their care. The Catholic social services, consistent with Catholic doctrine, would not place these precious children in Philadelphia in non-traditional homes, including LGBTQ homes. That was challenged by the city of Philadelphia and the Supreme Court unanimously. So this is a very important principle of the ability of church institutions, religious institutions, to carry on their work.
That, as you say, has become enshrined in American law. It has been at least embraced by the Supreme Court unanimously in this last term. There's been a number of rulings over time. Some scholars have argued religious liberty is sort of on a win streak in the last few years on the Supreme Court level. Yet, as you argue in the book, we see local governments, state governments, other levels of society not quite understanding or appreciating the primary importance of religious liberty, both for individuals and associations. Why is that?
The culture has shifted. I think the culture began shifting perhaps during the Enlightenment, but I think American culture has taken a dramatic shift over the last 20 years, perhaps beginning with 9/11, that individuals taking this horrific, unspeakable action in the name what? Of religion. And there seemed to be an outpouring of interest in the new atheism and so forth. But I think there are a variety of cultural factors, and one of them, frankly, is the idea of identity. Who is the individual? And sexual identity, gender identity, and so forth. These have been part of the forces, the winds that have been blowing, that have, I think, had an enormous effect on, well, if you are a religious person, you're probably a bigot. Right? You engage in discrimination. You hurt people. And so there's a bill pending in Congress called, provocatively, the Do No Harm Act. In other words, you can go worship wherever you want to, but don't try to bring your values into the marketplace of ideas.
And this is, we've sometimes heard this, and some of our listeners will be aware, the way that religious liberty is sometimes talked about. I was really intrigued by the fact you call it liberty of conscience, which of course resonates with people like from the American founding, like James Madison, who also called it that. To think of it as liberty of conscience or freedom of religion rather than just simply freedom of worship, it's a broader right. It's a more encompassing right, a right to sort of live out one's faith in private and in the public sphere. Is that how you want us in your book to understand?
Yes, and I use specific examples. Wisconsin said all kids have to go to essentially government schools until they reach their 16th birthday. The Amish community of Wisconsin, this is 40 years ago at the Supreme Court, once again serving as friend to religious liberty, said no. This community is empowered under the First Amendment to say, we're going to take an exit ramp and take our kids out. Not entirely. They only wanted their children, the Amish community only wanted their children to go through the 8th grade so they would have the rudimentary skills of citizenship and so forth. But after that, they were very concerned as a community about the secularizing effect of the culture, and what parent isn't concerned with the effect of peer pressure and so forth.
Right.
Even if they're secular parents, they're saying, boy, there's so many nasty influences out there. Well, homeschooling is an emergence, right, over the last generation to what was happening in the public schools and the kinds of values that were being transmitted. So I think what we're seeing right now is a high watermark, or maybe it's a low watermark, but a high watermark of opposition to religious faith, especially by the opinion leaders in the culture.
You give some thoughts on how to move forward to secure religious liberty for the next generation in the book. what are some of the most important steps that you think needs to be taken?
Step number one is exactly what the Ashbrook Center is seeking to do, which is education. And that was my purpose in writing the book. I wanted these principles of religious liberty as articulated by the Supreme Court to be accessible to a lay audience.
Right.
I was seeing in my mind's eye while writing it, a grandpa or grandma, I happen to be a grandfather or grandparents, reading the book to a high school student or even to a middle school student.
Yeah.
Not just reading it themselves, perhaps as a reminder, a refresher course, so to speak, but the transmission. We have a huge responsibility to transmit to the next generation our culture of freedom. And I don't think we've done a good job. The baby boom generation certainly tried, I think, but now when we see what's happening in the schools, these baleful influences that we see all around us, we have to respond. And this was just one individual's sense of what I can do to try to further and foster the goal of education.
Yeah, it's so critical. Reminds me of Ronald Reagan's farewell address in 1989, talking about the importance of what he called informed patriotism. Patriotism by itself is great, but not enough. People have to understand the principles of the country and love them because they understand them in order to sustain them. It sounds like the kind of argument you're making.
It's what I'm trying to say, that we have to perhaps make up for what we didn't receive in school with, again, the collapse of civic education. It hadn't collapsed so long ago when I was in school. When I went to public schools in Texas, and we learned more than Texas history. We did learn a good dollop of that, but we also learned the rudiments of American government and certainly American history. But again, what we see in the polls that have been taken, and the Ashbrook Center is very important in making these points, that 23% of American high school seniors are not proficient in the basic rudiments of American history.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking, actually. And this book is obviously, it's an issue on your mind, and you talk about, I love this phrase that you've got, the culture of freedom. It's a really important phrase because sometimes we think of freedom as a legal issue, as a political issue, not simply a cultural issue, or not fundamentally a cultural issue. But it seems to me you're right to point to that and the effect of education in shaping culture. You know, people say politics is downstream from culture, right? That what shapes culture eventually, of course, shapes politics. This issue of religious liberty has been on your mind, as you said. Is it one of the biggest challenges facing America today? Just take a step back for our listeners more broadly. What are some of the biggest challenges you see for the next generation facing our country?
The idea of eradication or compromising of liberty, cancel culture, these baleful influences manifest themselves in a variety of ways. No, I disagree with you, and therefore I do not want to hear you speak.
Right.
I don't want to read what you have to say. In fact, I think the curriculum is biased, prejudiced, or whatever. I don't want to read the history of white oppressors. I mean, you can just keep going. The 1619 Project of the New York Times and so forth. The whole idea that we should become much more racially conscious and aware and so forth. All these things I think are divisive, when in fact we stood at our best, imperfect to be sure, but that states the obvious. Welcome to humanity.
Right.
Imperfect to be sure, but we stood for the values of e pluribus unum. Out of many come one. The 50 states, what are we? I remember years ago running into an official of the government of Mexico who said, your country doesn't have a name. And I said, of course we do. We're the United States of America. He said, no, that's a description. What's your name? I said, well, I guess we're America. No. You're part of the North American continent. But notice the first word, united.
Yeah. United
States. We're not the independent and sovereign states, even though they're sovereign elements. We are the United States of America. But these forces are meant, I think, to tear us apart, tear us asunder, and question, frankly, the goodness of the principles of the American founding. And I'm not overlooking slavery. Slavery is an execrable, unspeakable evil, but it seems to have manifested itself throughout human society. That is, it wasn't invented here, right? But the horrible practice was brought here. But it was a universal practice, including the mother country. And it was the mother country that, of course, engaged in the slave trade, which had to be eliminated and so forth. The point is, let's not ignore that, but let's not say, as the 1619 Project would have us believe, that really is the fulcrum of American history. That's kind of that's who we are. No, it's not. And so my current research interest, by the way, is into the independence movement in the United States. What was galvanizing these patriots? And everything that I read, and I'm not a learned historian, I'm like others who read history and love history. One of the reasons I'm privileged to serve on the National Advisory Board. I love history and I love government and so forth, always wanting to learn more about it. And what do we learn at every turn? It was about freedom, and it was about rule of law. It was about constitutionalism, and whether the British had violated the Parliament with the acquiescence of King George, had violated the British Constitution, these fundamental foundations. And in leading up to the Revolution, everyone talked constitutionalism.
Right.
Everyone talked about the Constitution, but they were talking about the Constitution of Great Britain and the Bill of Rights and so forth. That's who we are. And it's one of the reasons that the preface to the preamble to America, it's a preface, but the preamble to America's Constitution talks about as the ultimate, the summum bonum is to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Not the blessings of equality, but the blessings of liberty. Now, we want equal opportunity for all, but we want liberty, the freedom to innovate, the freedom to march to the beat of our own drummer. Whereas I think these cultural forces are saying, no, it's only my drummer. That's the only drum that gets to make any noise.
So you really see a great challenge for the next generation of America, as, if I'm understanding your argument here, and it's a really interesting and provocative one, as sort of, can the principles that brought this country into being, articulated in places like the Declaration of Independence, embodied in the Constitution, can we sustain our understanding of and attachment to those principles and remain united as one people?
And to love these principles, not simply to understand them, but as you say on the website, to have affection for these principles. And you don't have to lionize those. We were chatting offline about a particular teacher dismissing Abraham Lincoln, as a racist. Well, my word, see the fullness of the man, and the fullness of the man, fairly viewed and reasonably viewed, as a great humanitarian who was opposed to the scourge of slavery, and who was supportive of General Grant in the effort to bring African American troops into active service and to give them real responsibility and so forth. The Freedmen's Bureau, the appropriate treatment of the newly freed slaves and so forth. These were noble principles, imperfect to be sure.
Yeah. It's really amazing that you've developed this passion. I suppose it connects in many ways to your previous work. You have been a member, of course, you've been United States Solicitor General, I think argued over 30 cases in front of the Supreme Court.
Yes.
You have been on the bench itself.
Yes.
From your time on the bench and arguing in front of the Supreme Court, what's your sense, and being dean of a very prominent law school, what's your sense now of the state of legal education, of lawyers and judges' understanding of the Constitution?
I think that the legal profession has become, like so much of society, very politicized. I mentioned the Philadelphia case, and I'll just use this as an example. Instead of staying at a high level of generality, let's do a case study. The American Bar Association filed a friend of the court brief on behalf of the city of Philadelphia and against Catholic social services. And again, the Supreme Court decided unanimously the other way. So it suggests that the organized bar, and I'm a member of the American Bar Association, participates in its program. At least the leadership is really out of touch with mainstream constitutionalism.
Right.
A unanimous
unanimous
opinion.
Supreme Court.
But they were on the other side. And why? Because I think the culture war is not wanting to in any way countenance, as they see it, quote, discrimination, when in fact what Catholic social services were doing, just to stay on it, because it's such a powerful, almost parable of the conflict that is raging in the United States, is we will place children in single-family homes of LGBTQ persons. We will place LGBTQ children. So it's not as if we say we're not going to serve everyone, but we can't, consistent with our Catholic teaching of 2 millennia, place them in non-traditional homes. We just can't do that. I mean, of 2-person homes. So, but there it is. There's the legal education then lends itself into the American Bar Association and so forth. So I think much too much of legal education is deeply politicized.
Yeah. I guess on the other hand, the welcome news, at least for the federal judiciary and the Supreme Court, I think a lot of our listeners would think or wonder, has there been a resurgence of constitutional, I'll call it constitutional conservatism, I don't know if that's the right word, originalism as a jurisprudence, an approach to understanding law and the Constitution? Intellectually, there seems to have been some revival of that, and politically, we have a lot of very sound judges on the court now. What's your take on the state of originalism and in law and in jurisprudence?
I think it's taken very seriously across a wide spectrum of judges and justices, even justices who would say, I'm not an originalist or I'm a faint-hearted originalist at best, nonetheless have great respect for the founding materials. You will see the most liberal justices cite the Federalist Papers, right? They will just say, well, look what Madison said in Federalist 51 or Hamilton said in Federalist 78. So I think it's very healthy, as opposed to when I was clerking for Chief Justice Warren Burger many years ago. There was a huge fight going on in the legal academy, and even judges became involved in it, and then it reached the apogee, the apex in the Reagan administration.
Right, yeah.
When, now so long ago, originalism was dismissed as sort of a quirky, odd, unorthodox, not really respected train of thought. And so too, the idea of the text of a statute passed by Congress, we now use the term textualism. We take this seriously. We don't just go running to legislative history to see what the sponsors said.
Right.
And these were, by the way, outgrowths, logical outgrowths of reflections on separation of powers. If you talk about what the co-sponsor said, and so you give that meaning, well, wait, was that voice heard in the House of Representatives? Or vice versa? Right. Oh, was that voice heard by the president? Was the president tuning in? And so he said, oh, that's what that means. Okay, bring me my signature pen. Or if that's what it means, I'm going to veto it, right?
Yeah.
So the separation of powers, the idea of presentment, we got in some very bad habits in the 20th century, constitutionally, not taking separation of powers seriously, not taking federalism seriously. Both those principles are taken very seriously.
Welcome news.
It is welcome
news.
Rediscovery.
Right. Very welcome news.
Now, we're seeing this play out, by the way, in the mandates. I mean, whatever one's position is on vaccinations, I'm fully vaccinated, and I have no moral, religious objection to it. To me, it's just the right thing to do as a matter of individual liberty and choice. But these mandates wildly exceed the Biden mandate, the OSHA mandate. In my judgment, wildly exceed Congress's authority. If Congress tried to do it, I think it would be a serious constitutional question on the Commerce Clause. But the statutes under which they're operating, they being OSHA and now CMS and the latest iteration of vaccine mandates, these are illegal virtually on their face. They're sort of dead on arrival by my reading.
Right.
Now, watch me be proven wrong. I've been proven wrong any number of times.
We'll see if
but I know my position at least is grounded in fundamental principles of the Constitution. And so why do we stray from those? And I think that's a serious question. President Biden, Attorney General Garland, why are you authorizing these kinds of, well, we get to test them in the courts. But why are you authorizing it when it seems to be so blatantly unconstitutional under the Commerce Clause and anti-textual under the Social Security Act?
Yeah, that's a very important point, that the executive branch, the president, the attorney general, are themselves constitutional officers who should be taking their own duty to interpret the Constitution very seriously.
They took an oath. And so it's so serious that the Justice Department has an ancient practice, ancient by U.S. standards, that it will not defend certain acts that Congress passes, even though the Justice Department, as part of the executive branch, is duty-bound to faithfully execute the law. But still in all, the Justice Department will say, no, we have a higher duty to the Constitution, and this statute violates the Constitution, in our view.
You have had, you have had such an interesting and varied career in public life. You have been in leadership of higher education. You've been involved in the judicial branch at the highest levels. You've been in the executive branch in the highest levels. We've got a lot of listeners to the American Idea who are young people, who are very interested in a career in public life and thinking about this. Over your long career in public life and your experience, give us some advice about what those young people should be thinking about if they're considering entering public life.
A substantive point and then a skills point. The substantive point is not original. It's drawn from Winston Churchill. Study history. And then he repeated
I like the sound of that.
Study history and keep studying history, because it's this endlessly deep well of wisdom and guidance. And then on the skill set, work on communication skills, both writing and verbal, and wean yourself from the current kind of inarticulate conversation in a business setting. Speak however you want with your friends, but just become a much more effective communicator verbally. And that means not having the kinds of pauses and kinds of things. It's just it's self-discipline as well as just habit. But years ago, I saw a fantastic interview when television was a little bit more serious. CBS would interview these very serious people: Hugo Black, Justice of the Supreme Court; William O. Douglas, Justice of the Supreme Court. And they interviewed John J. McCloy. Who the heck is that? Well, John J. McCloy was a very distinguished lawyer and public servant. And the interviewer, Eric Severide, or who it was, a name lost in the midst of history, said, "You have a reputation as an excellent writer. What's your approach? What's your secret?" He said, "I go through draft after draft. I self-edit myself. I will try to go through, if I have the time, 10 or 11 drafts to get it right."
Wow.
So we can all work on communication skills.
Yes. That kind of discipline, as you say, so important for success in a career in public life. Thank you for those reflections. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again for joining Ashbrook's efforts to bring American history and government across the country in a very sound way to students and teachers. Ken Starr, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you.